Hey Internet, so today is going to be the much awaited political ideologies tier list. There's quite a few of these out there, but none of them have ever been done by a Hoppean libertarian or Mises Caucus libertarian like myself, and today that shall be remedied. You can take this video kind of half as a meme and half serious, because before I even get into it, I kind of want to point out something about political ideologies that a lot of people don't really consider, which is that it's very important to rate them based on something that actually makes some level of objective sense. It's really easy to just put your own ideology or whatever you believe in on S tier and everything else in trash tier. I'm not going to be doing that. I mean, I kinda am, but I'm going to be fair. This is going to be as fair as possible, as well as giving a basic idea of what these ideologies are and why I'm rating them the way I'm rating them. First off, the chart itself. I'm going to be rating these based on their equivalence to the status quo. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are the status quo if they end up in this section. It just means that they don't actually offer anything that is better to society than the current status quo. So in other words, the way the rating system works is, does this make society better than the current status quo, or does it make people worse off than the status quo? And I'll be taking everything into consideration with this, so ethics, philosophy, praxis, whether it's even viable to work or not, which, by the way, that's why we have this one way down here. Are you 7 years old? This is where the ideologies that are just effectively self-contradictory or just completely nonsensical will end up. So you can look at this bottom tier as kind of off the chart, as a dumping ground for ridiculous ideas that would either destroy society or are ideas that are completely utopian in concept and would thus never actually give birth to any kind of society due to the ideology being some form or another of trying to have your cake and eat it too. Basically things that only children actually believe in. Something you thought might be a really great idea when you were 6 or 7 years old or something. But once you become an adult and learn how the real world works, you stop believing in it. Also, this particular video has no sponsor, but there is a new graphics-based Hoppean shirt out on the merch store. Kind of the opposite of what I did previously with some shirts that are text only. I'm going to be putting some shirts out that are just graphics only. All profits go directly towards helping me create my content. Link will be in the description below. Anyways, without further babbling, let us get started. I'm going to be basing this on PolCompBall Wiki because it is significantly more fun than anything else, although I'm not going to go over all of them because quite frankly a lot of them are just meme ideologies or aren't meaningfully different than other ideologies. But I'll go over a few memes anyway because what the hell. First off, we're going to start with elective monarchism. This one's pretty self-explanatory. It's kind of like monarchy except you democratically elect the monarch when the old monarch passes. It's slightly better than the status quo. Monarchy can be pretty based, and elective monarchism does solve one of the key problems with democracy, which is a lack of ownership, which sort of disincentivizes responsibility. But it's not really as good as other forms. It is just a slightly better version of democracy, really. Next up is agorism. This is where you try to use black markets to subvert the state. Things like alternative currency so they can't tax you. It's gained quite a large following within cryptocurrency communities, for obvious reasons, kind of. Anyway, as I've said before, it's pretty based. I don't think that it would work as a strategy, though, towards working towards getting rid of the current status quo. I think you would need to do more than just agorism. It also does have potential to lead to conflict in the future. It wouldn't be the agorist's fault if that were to happen, but it's worth noting. Next up is classical liberalism. This is really just an attempt to return liberalism to the greater respect for the free market that it used to have roughly a century ago, to maybe half a century ago. It is better than the status quo. It is kind of a version of light libertarianism where you're still technically a liberal. Its only downside is that there's no guarantee you wouldn't just end up right back where you started if you were to do it. But it is better than the status quo. I would say classical liberalism is something you can use as a stepping stone to greater heights. Anyway, next up is anarcho-egoism. The idea that government, private property, and other people's rights and morality and freedom and whatnot are all just spooks getting in the way of focusing on yourself. Directly down to, are you 7 years old? Yep, that's right. This is the first time I get to make a few people mad. Hopefully not too many, because I'd like to think that people are smart enough to understand why this wouldn't actually work. The issue with anarcho-egoism is that it kind of makes sense from a selfish perspective. The issue is that if everybody actually followed it to its logical conclusion, society wouldn't work. It's more like, in this case, are you an edgy teenager? Oh, why are all these rules in my way, man? And anarcho-egoism just kind of gives a pseudo-intellectual way to put a academic gloss on that kind of thinking. I view it as a navel-gazy way to try and justify not giving a crap. But the reality is, when it comes to a political ideology, it needs to provide a political system that would actually provide a working, functional, moral society. Just because something is a social construct or a spook doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you can ignore ignore it if you want to enjoy the benefits of society. So pretty stupid. I've never met anybody older than 17 who actually believes this. Next up is anarcho-syndicalism. Now this one's kind of a tragedy because the idea of a decentralized society can work, but doing it by worker-owned syndicates falls into kind of the same moral questions as communism does. And it would ultimately collapse due to having a lack of any kind of ethical model for society to follow. At least not an objective one. It's very close to Are You 7 Years Old, but it at least tries to come up with a model of society that would kind of work. It just would probably only work for about a few months tops before collapsing in on itself, as they would ultimately fight amongst each other. I think a lot of anarcho-syndicalists would become Hoppians if they were to properly learn economics, and also stop falling for dumb lefty prod propaganda. It's like a fake version of freedom that wouldn't actually function, due to it believing in a lot of stupid things like profit is theft. Next is authoritarian capitalism, which is just a society run by a market system, except there's still a very big authoritarian state and cronyism is the accepted norm. I kind of like to think of it as rhinoism, because it's exactly the kind of stupid crap that George Bush used to do. It's in the status quo, but kind of at the bottom of the status quo. I'm not going to put these in any particular order. They're all just going to be kind of in their category, but this one just barely qualifies for status quo. Next is oligarchy. This is where the rich use the state to make it illegal to compete with them, and then effectively run the country. It pretty much is the status quo. Then there's Caesarism. Now, this is a bit controversial, because Caesarism is really just the ideas of the Roman Empire and how they functioned. And the problem with the Roman Empire is that they were very high on conquest, and they used that conquest to bolster their economic prowess. Now, back in the day of the Roman Empire, mainly due to the lack of modern technology, society almost entirely relied on farming, and thus economics was actually more zero-sum. So for its time, Caesarism kind of made sense, even though it was a little bit evil. However, if you were to redo Caesarism today, it would be very stupid. So for its day, it was a pretty effective system, but now it would be bad. So I'm going to be nice to Caesarism and just put it in the status quo. But just know that this one kinda has time-based context here. The Roman Empire had its time in the sun where it made sense, and that time is no more. Anyways, next is Christian democracy. This is kind of a version of democracy that uses natural law theory combined with Christianity, and also kind of uses the Bible as well as the work of Thomas Aquinas as the basis for its constitution. It's slightly better than the status quo, but only if you're a Christian. However, the thing is, this kind of society wouldn't allow you to live with them anyways unless you were a Christian, because it does have an authoritarian stance on borders in that regards, so they would kick you out anyways. So better than the status quo if you are a Christian, worse than it if you aren't. I'm just going to be fair and put it in the middle. Next is civic nationalism. This is really just nationalism, but without any kind of ethnic racism in between it. Anyone who's willing to join the nation and then identify with that nation as opposed to identifying with whatever they were before can then become a civic nationalist. I personally don't think it would work. It's too authoritarian, it has some good ideas, and if a civic nationalist society followed a more free market system, it could kind of be better than the status quo. So just to be fair, I will again throw this one in the middle. Equal to status quo, but could go either way, depending on context. Next is constitutional monarchism. It ultimately is just a very, very slightly better version of democracy. It's just that instead of electing the king, you just kind of have the king as a figurehead, or with limited power. That's how it's different to elective monarchism, in case anybody didn't know. Although honestly, constitutional monarchy is pretty common in this day and age, especially in a lot of European countries still. So you get the gist of it. I think it's slightly better than the status quo of just democracy. It has potential to be better than the status quo, but unfortunately a lot of European countries also follow the ideology of globalism, and thus they are stuck with status quo crap. So this one just kind of goes to the bottom of slightly better than status quo. Next is corporatism. You know, a lot of people try to be fancy and come up with corporatist ideas and paint them as a form of decentralized society, but still centralized based on the state and certain corporations and different sectors and whatnot. But the reality is they're wrong. It's really just more status quo. Sorry, corporatists. It's not going to work better if we just become more corporatist. Next up is feudalism, which was a statist but decentralized society where the king just kind of passed power down the line, down to barons and lords and such. You, however, would probably be a serf working under some lord of the land. And here's the sad thing. In many ways, it would actually be better than the status quo, because medieval serfs owed less to their lord than many of us owe to the state in terms of taxes today. Yeah, we're actually serfs. Even worse than serfs. We actually work more than serfs. Kind Kinda sad, really. Next is Hoppeanism, immediately straight to goat. This is an actual decentralized society that would ultimately structure everything based on privately owned cities that would strongly respect freedom of association and the NAP and whatnot. An oversimplified way to think of this is a form of minarchist monarchy, except it's privatized and owned by an actual CEO. And there's a whole lot of them. So if the United States were to become Hoppean, you can think of every single county being its own private society. That is an extremely oversimplified way of putting it, but the TLDR is that it is an actual decentralized society that actually works and disincentivizes conflict rather than incentivizing it, and actually respects people's property rights. The only real downside to it is that it's very hard to achieve, but when achieved, it becomes very, very stable. It's something that you could actually conquer the stars with, but again, very hard to get to, just because of how radically different it is in relation to how the status quo works. Next is anarcho-monarchism. This one actually isn't that different from Hoppeanism, except you actually do have a monarch. There's slight debates on whether or not it counts as anarchy still, or if it's just an extremely minarchist version of Hoppeanism. I will stick it up with GOAT right next to Hoppeanism because I think it's slightly easier for people to understand, even if it isn't technically completely accurate. Next is gerontocracy, which is a system of rule where you just kind of have a council of elders. It's where the elderly make up most of the government. And the funny thing is, and with the way that democracy works, in actual practice, it kind of often ends up being no different. So, status quo. Next up is market socialism, which is a version of socialism that keeps a market economy and kind of keeps it within a corporatist structure and tries to keep the corporatism a little bit more democratic. But the problem is it runs into the same economic problems as normal socialism does, just slightly slower. So it's kind of one of the least bad versions of straight up socialism. And it also does not work very well. Womp womp. Next up is illegalism. This honestly, functionally is not that different than anarcho-egoism. It's just being a little bit more honest about it. It's stating that being a criminal should not be looked down upon and it's just another valid way of living your life because hey, they're just following their ego, man. It still goes into are you 7 years old? Same problem. I've never seen anybody who was an actual adult that unironically believed this. And if there are any adults who unironically believe this, then may God have mercy on their soul. Next up is straight up democracy. Now, this is not to be confused with liberal democracy, which is the current status quo in many nations. This is just straight up democracy. No constitution needed to keep the people in check. And rational voters don't exist. Worse than the status quo. Moving on. Democratic socialism. It tries to pretend like because it's democratic that it's better than regular socialism, or that it has some kind of system in place to make socialism more efficient. Spoiler alert, it does not. Still runs into the economic calculation problem and knowledge problem. Doesn't work, it's dumb. Next is Dengism. This is actually the ideology of President Xi of China, which means it can alternatively be called Winnie the Poohism, but in function it's really just kinda similar to authoritarian capitalism, except they view it as a road to communism. It's sort of a Chinese philosophy of communism that you need to use capitalism to get to communism, and they believe that the reason they had problems with Mao was because they tried to jump the gun too quickly. In reality, it is just cope. It's commies not willing to accept the fact that their ideology doesn't work. Next is absolute monarchism, which I'm pretty sure most people know what absolute monarchism is. It is a state where the monarch holds all the power. It's actually not as bad as people think it is. A lot of people view absolute monarchy as some backwards thing from way back in the day. But the thing is, absolute monarchy has one very large benefit, which is that you know who's at fault for all the problems. A lot of times things like liberal democracy have the issue where the power is hidden in all these little dysfunctional bureaucracies. And so it's harder to pinpoint who exactly is at fault for all the corruption, where this is not really the case with absolute monarchy. If an absolute monarchist state becomes corrupt, it's generally the fault of the absolute monarch. There's a reason why it worked for so long. Next is distributism. Now, I imagine a lot of people don't actually know what distributism is, and it's kind of impossible to do so in something that's just a silly political ideologies tier list video. So here's an extreme oversimplification. It's kind of a right-wing fusion of capitalism and socialism, but a little bit more towards the capitalist side, where it tries to use the state to have as many capitalists as possible. In other words, it tries to use force to break up corporations into smaller family-owned businesses and cooperatives, but then still keeps it as private ownership. So it's still a little bit more towards capitalism than socialism. And so in that regard, it evenly distributes the capitalism. The main flaw of it really just comes down to the question of who does the distributing, and how do you prevent them from becoming corrupt? Who watches the watcher there? And because of that, I'm a little bit skeptical. It might be a little bit better than the status quo, maybe for a little while, style. So again, I'm not putting these in any specific order, so I'm gonna put it as better than status quo, simply because a lot of distributists are based. But the reality is, it probably isn't gonna be much better than status quo. And it could very, very easily be subverted by Marxists. So I'm being very charitable to the distributists here. Next up is jingoism, which is kind of an aggressive nationalist state that uses violence to advance its economic interests. Basically kind of steals from other countries and gives to its own citizens. It's kind of what you end up believing if you, again, do not understand that the modern economic world is entirely capable of not being zero-sum. Instead, jingoism kind of forces it to be zero-sum. As I said with Caesarism, bringing this to the modern day would not work and would not make sense, and would honestly probably just lead to a third world war, probably a nuclear war. This is another one that you're probably an edgy teenager if you believe it, unironically. However, it's a little bit more functional than egoism, so I'll just put it in dumb. Next is Juche. This is the political ideology of North Korea, specifically the founder of North Korea. It is a Marxist-Leninist adjacent ideology formed by the previous leader Kim Il-sung, or the original leader, and it's effectively the idea that a communist society would have to be a self-reliant communist state. In practice, of course, it just traps its citizens in eternal poverty. I do give it some credit for being the only version of Marxist-Leninism that has actually proven itself capable of lasting longer than a couple generations. It is the only ML state that technically still exists, and because of that I'm going to give it worse than status quo, but it's pretty darn close to dumb. The only reason I'm not putting it in dumb, it's simply because it has managed to kind of function, albeit stupidly and unethically. Or actually no, I'm going to put it in dumb. It only manages to survive from the aid of other countries, which kind of contradicts its whole self-reliance mantra. Next is Ingsoc. This is just the ideology of 1984. It is effectively the belief that the government should do everything as much as possible, and that there's nothing wrong with brainwashing the citizens in order to keep society functional. You'd be surprised, but there actually are some adults out there who unironically believe that the state should do everything. And they are very dumb. Next up is kleptocracy, which is rule by thieves. Now, kleptocracy is more of a pejorative. No state that has ever existed has actually called itself a kleptocracy. Instead, it's usually just intellectuals labeling states as such, because they allow them to be ruled by thieves. And technically, if you were to go by natural law theory, all states to some degree are kleptocratic. But what it mainly describes is what happens when that just goes completely unchecked. For example, the Bank of Zimbabwe situation. And in many ways, the Fed is kleptocratic. So as sad as it is actually the status quo. Next is critarchy. This is a system of government where the judicial branch kind of has all the say. This one can go either way depending on where the law is coming from that the judges are making their decisions on. If it's natural law, then it's actually very based. However, if it's some kind of nonsense law, which sadly that's what critarchy usually ends up being, then it's worse than the status quo. Next is Kratorocracy. You know, Kratos. This is might makes right pushed to its logical conclusions. And it is honestly just a slightly right-wing version of egoism. Again, I'd be very, very surprised if anybody who actually believes this is older than 17 years old. So it's just another edgy teenager meme ideology. Next is ethno-nationalism. Most people know what this is, and it is slightly worse than the status quo. See, the problem with ethno-nationalism is it's kind of a wrong answer to the problems of society. If you were to actually try and do ethno-nationalism, it would probably cause a mass civil internal conflict. Ethno-nationalists are another thing where I almost put this in Are You 7 Years Old? Because again, it's a lot of times the edgy teenage wignots who haven't really learned everything about the world yet. They're the ones who tend to believe this. I kind of wish that they would just grow up and realize that there are voluntary ways to achieve a homogenous society, ones that don't violate the rights of the people who aren't part of the society, ones that can actually be achieved through peaceful means, and more importantly, are actually sustainable, because that's another issue with ethno-nationalism. It usually needs some other system to tack onto, and there's no guarantee that that system would be good. What most ethno-nationalists should instead be pushing for are things like returning to freedom of association, or things like abolishing the Civil Rights Act. That's how you actually fix those problems. Then there's Fabian socialism. This is just an attempt to slowly walk to socialism. Strangely, the Fabian method would be a smarter way to work towards capitalism, but Fabian socialism, it's dumb. The only benefit to it is that you can actually stop it. Then there's actual straight-up, unironic fascism. Now, it actually does create a somewhat stable society, for as long as they can keep up the grift. Next up is straight-up anarchism. Now, this is gonna be a fun one, and this might sound strange coming from a Hoppean like myself, because technically, at least in the way that the Austrian school defines anarchy, Hoppeanism is a version of anarchism. However, the reason that version of anarchy works, the reason why anarcho-capitalism can function, actually has to do with a different way that normal anarchists and anarcho-capitalists define the word anarchy. Anarcho anarcho-capitalists view anarchy as just the gnat pushed to its logical conclusions, which means that people have to voluntarily associate with society, rather than a state forcing people to pay taxes into a society. And this causes a lot of the Reddit tier anarchist types, who believe anarchy is more or less something that is to be against hierarchies, to whine and cry and say that, oh, that means that Hoppeanism and anarcho-capitalism aren't really anarchy. And without going too technical into that, yes, if you were to go by the definition of anarchy, that anarchy is being against hierarchies, then yeah, you could say that anarcho-capitalism isn't really anarchy. There's very good arguments as to why that's not actually accurate, and why anarchy should be defined in the way that anarcho-capitalists view it, but the bigger problem is that even if we were to give in to that, and just give the definition of anarchism to the Reddit anarchists, then that would just make anarchy stupid, because you need hierarchy for a society to function. You can't have no rules at all and no principles guiding a society. All that does is create a power vacuum because you can't actually get rid of hierarchies. And thinking that you can is just utopian nonsense. Stop being 7 years old. Next is libertarian monarchism, which is kind of a minarchist version of Hoppeanism and anarcho-monarchism. And it is quite based. I don't think it's as ideal as Hoppeanism, obviously. I mean, I am a Hoppean. However, one thing I will give libertarian monarchists is that it's significantly easier to achieve. You could potentially use it as a stepping stone to Hoppeanism. In fact, Liechtenstein comes pretty darn close to achieving it, which is a pretty darn wealthy country considering its size. Probably the best system of rule of law and just overall governance if you had to stick with the statist model. And I know I said I wasn't going to order these in any particular order, but I'm going to stick this one at the top of based just to emphasize the fact that it's very close to being goated. Next is paleo-libertarianism. This is really just the recognition that libertarianism needs to be fundamentally right-wing in some way. It's the first step of a libertarian to become less cringe and more based, by just kind of recognizing that time preferences are synonymous with the conservative parts of cultural ideas that are actually good for the proliferation and maintenance of society. Next is libertarian socialism. Are you 7 years old? This is believing that you can have your cake and eat it too by not understanding that positive freedom is just the benefits of wealth. You cannot have the benefits of wealth without a system that incentivizes the creation of that wealth. Anybody professing this idea is either a child or a grifter trying to sell utopia. Maoism. This is the version of Marxist-Leninism that Mao originally ported to China. And oh god, did it not work. China saw zero economic growth throughout the reign of Maoism. Anybody wanting to try his ideology again is just either 7 years old or very dumb. I will put it in dumb simply because it kind of at least had a somewhat functional society, albeit one run through terror and stupidity. Next is Marxism, the basis for pretty much all leftist economic thought today. And it does not work. It doesn't work at all. Then there's Marxist-Leninism, pretty much the same thing, but with Lenin's more authoritarian ideas tacked onto it, and a bit more model for a society that kinda sorta functioned. It did manage to last in Russia for longer than a single generation, but it's still dumb. Next is conservative liberalism. This is really just liberal democracy, except with the belief that you need to have conservatives always in charge. So it's kind of a version of liberalism that respects time preferences a little bit better. The only problem is, how do you maintain it? But it is at least better than the status quo. Next is anarcho-capitalism, and I'm going to interpret this a little bit differently. I'm going to rate this as anarcho-capitalism without the ideas of Hans Hermann Hoppe in place. So could anarcho-capitalism work without the concept of physical removal? And the answer is, I think it would be really hard to achieve and really hard to maintain. It is ethical, and it could actually work, but there's a reason why a lot of people who haven't read Hoppe are very skeptical of it. And I think it would have a very hard time keeping itself going and not creating a power vacuum that leads to just the formation of the state again if you don't find a way to physically remove the Marxists. I think anarcho-capitalism needs to have an actual strategy attached to it, or else it's in danger. Next is matriarchy, a society centered around women, and nothing else really. Now, in all seriousness, the problem with matriarchal societies is that they're able to maintain themselves, but they never actually advance. Because they tend to focus a bit too much on equality, they end up kind of being a proto-version of communism. So they've never really gone beyond the tribal stage. It's the kind of thing you end up believing in if you have swallowed the postmodernist progressive Kool-Aid a bit too hard. Mediacracy is next. And this is a funny one because it's basically the status quo. It's not just equal to status quo, it kind of to some degree is the status quo if you're living in a democracy. The state, along with corporate media, actually have a very large revolving door relationship with each other. So it's very often the same people, just at different times. I think a lot of normies would be extraordinarily shocked to find out just how many people who are currently working for the mainstream media are ex-feds or are currently still feds, as well as the other way around. Because the thing is, the media, being the main source of information, can effectively, to some degree, control how voters vote, which allows them to steer and shape society within the common goals of the state and media as those two systems effectively become one and the same. same. Next is straight minarchy. This is just the idea that the government should only be involved in protection of private property rights, and pretty much nothing else. Or the night watchman state, as it's sometimes called. It is definitely better than the status quo. The problem is it's very hard to prevent it from growing more than minarchy. This is what makes it directly inferior to libertarian monarchism, of which the monarch can actually step in and prevent it from growing. Minarchism, especially liberal minarchism, can easily get lost in the bureaucracy of liberalism and just find itself growing. It just keeps on growing and growing and growing until 300 years later you somehow have ink soak. However, it is better than the status quo, and in order to reach greater heights you would have to kind of move back towards minarchism while recognizing it as more of a stepping stone again rather than the end goal, because it's not very stable. Next is minarcho-socialism. Does not exist. Are you 7 years old? Anybody who does not understand that a command economy ultimately requires a strong centralized government authority is either very foolish or a child. And if they don't even understand that that's how socialist economics actually work in praxis, then I feel sorry for them. Very, very deeply confused individuals. It's slightly less stupid than the anarchist versions of communism, because at least it recognizes a small state, but the problem is socialism would ultimately require a large state. You can't have that with minarchy. It contradicts what minarchism is. Then there's monarchism, just straight up monarchism as a general concept. Now, I was kind of not going to even include this because of other monarchy-based ideologies I was going over, but it is important to point out why monarchy in general is just slightly better than the status quo. And the issue is that democracy doesn't actually put the people in charge. It tricks people into thinking that they are in charge, but they're really not. It's ultimately bureaucrats who are in charge. Currently, it's the mediocrity that is in charge and the kleptocracy that is in charge and the oligarchy that is in charge, as well as just the general bureaucracy that they tend to support that is in charge. At least talking about how the United States currently functions. With monarchy in general, the problems of society, they're a little bit more obvious. You don't have this issue in democracy where it's ultimately the media that takes charge and gaslights people about what's wrong with the world. When there's a monarchist system, people know who's in charge, and so they know who's at fault for when things go wrong. And monarchs have a much, much greater incentive to give a crap about the continuation of their nation, whereas politicians really don't have that incentive at all because they can just get away with lining their own pockets, and then having their media allies point the finger somewhere else. Next is mutualism, which is best described as kind of an anarchist version of market socialism that tries to find common ground with anarcho-capitalism. And it just doesn't work. The problem is that what it is seeking to achieve can actually be achieved within anarcho-capitalism, especially within Hoppeanism, through just fraternal mutual aid societies. There's no need to create this alternative anarchist philosophy around it, and the Marxist editions just make it completely non-functional. And really, it's just an ideology that didn't need to exist. Next up is monarcho-socialism. It is literally just Juche. I mean, not quite the same, but in practice it would be the same thing. In theory, it doesn't have the whole self-reliance that Kim Il-sung added, but in practice it's what it effectively ended up being. Next up is neoliberalism, which kinda just is the status quo. Neoliberalism is just the ideas of liberal democracy exported to the rest of the world. It's globalist liberalism and a mixed market economy that pretty much most countries follow to some degree these days. Next is national Bolshevism, which just takes the ideology of nationalism and fuses it into communism. It's usually a culturally more right-leaning version of communism, but I believe that it would most likely devolve into just straight communism and then society would collapse, which means it is actually another thing that is not that meaningfully different from Juche. Next is alt-light. This is kind of where your standard Zoomer conservative ends up being, when they are smart enough to not quite take the Wignot plunge, but not smart enough to look into some serious conservative or actual right-leaning economic theory. They can be based, but they can also be a little bit dumb at times. But I'll give them some optimism and put them as slightly better than status quo. However, alt-light is usually a stepping stone into somewhere else on the right side of the political spectrum. Next is national capitalism, which is really just an authoritarian state that tries to go by a market economy anyway. Think Pinochet. Now, it can have good outcomes at least, but it can also go the opposite direction and get subverted. And it also tends to come with some pretty bad human rights violations. This is actually a really hard one to rate, because in terms of living in it, it's actually slightly better to live in a national capitalist society than it is to live in the current status quo. However, the ethical questions it raises makes it really hard to rate it there. So I'm gonna put it as better than status quo, but it is really just a slightly less status quo-y version of authoritarian capitalism. It's not somewhere where you actually want to be. It's on the bottom there. And in some ways, it's actually contradictory. For instance, if I were to rate it entirely based on ethics, I would actually throw it down to are you 7 years old? Anyway, next up is national libertarianism, which is kind of a mixed bag. But the best way to understand it is that they're kind of what you'd call small L libertarians. They believe you kind of need a somewhat nationalist, conservative, minarchist state in order to maintain libertarian values and order. And in some ways, they're kind of right. And in other ways, they're kind of wrong. but regardless, they're fairly based. It is a potential stepping stone towards Hoppeanism. Next is alt-right, and this is going to be another weird one, because I am actually going to rate it as being equal to status quo. What? How? Aren't alt-righters completely the opposite of the status quo? Yes, they kind of are, sort of, at least according to their own theory. But remember, when I'm saying equal to status quo, I don't necessarily mean that they are the status quo, just that the ideologies I'm sticking in here would not be meaningfully better or worse than the status quo. The alt-right mixes a few base things with some really bad populist economic ideas, along with authoritarian measures of kicking people out, which again would just lead to civil unrest, as opposed to reasonable freedom of association based ways of doing that. So bad economic policy and bad ethics policy. And this creates a problem, which is that the alt-right doesn't really have a philosophical justification that makes sense on a meta-ethical level against the left. This is kind of why the alt-right saw a decline, because it was really easy for the breadtube types to come in and basically just take a dunk on them. Because while the alt-right and breadtube, neither of them believe on anything on principle, can at least sell their ideas with equality. They have a much more utopian sounding philosophy, whereas the alt-right is just doom and gloom. And because of that, the alt-right doesn't really do much good. My main hope for them is that they, similar to the ethno-nationalists, eventually figure out the error of their ways, and hopefully learn how economics actually works and what right-wing theory actually is, and so that they can evolve into one of the other right-leaning theories that are up here that are, you know, actually somewhat functional, and have real ethical and philosophical models behind them, instead of, again, just being edgy teenage wignots that are easily exposed as clueless by any rhetorically skilled leftist. But anyway, next up is globalism, which is very close to being the status quo, unfortunately, because it is actually worse than the status quo. Globalism is the ideology of the World Economic Forum types, mixing bad ideas like postmodernist cultural relativism with economic cronyism and exporting it to the global stage. On paper, they try to sell it as global cooperation and partnership, but because they are economic authoritarians at their core, what they really end up being is just global hegemony. Or in other words, it is the cathedral pushed to its logical clown world conclusion. Anyway, next up is neo-Marxism, which is kind of funny because neo-Marxism is the ideology of pretty much all breadtubers and modern-day communists today. With a few rare exceptions, such as there are a few unironic National Bolshevik types who technically don't fall under the neo-Marxist label. There are some tankies who manage to kind of break out of it, but the vast majority of sort of far lefties do believe in some way in neo-Marxism, which is Marxist ideology infused with sort of things like critical theory and postmodernist theory and sort of social justice progressivism, etc., etc. So just about every Reddit socialist that you interact with to some degree believes in neo-Marxism, which is funny because none of them will actually call themselves neo-Marxists, even though it's a very effective explanation of what they are. And it is dumb. It is oh so very dumb. Philosophies that share adjacency with neo-Marxism are for the most part the absolute height of midwittery. They're the kind of dumb things you end up believing in if you hang out in progressive echo chambers, and are just not quite smart enough to recognize the logical fallacies that are being spewed within those echo chambers. Alternatively, you can kind of think of them as the useful idiots for globalists, which is kind of sad and kind of hilarious because neo-Marxists all believe that they're the ones standing up against the globalists. They don't realize that neo-Marxism just justifies globalist control, because that is the praxis that is justified through the equity fallacy that neo-Marxists believe in. Next is neoconservatism, which is really just economic centrism mixed with aggressive foreign policy. What have they conserved? No, seriously, what have they conserved? The neocons conserved absolutely nothing, and I'm gonna dump them in dumb, despite the fact that neocons aren't actually as dumb as some of these other ideologies that I put in dumb. In fact, they're really just adjacent to the status quo. I believe that their uselessness and overall damage that they've caused to the concept of low time preference being tied to conservatism, it deserves a special place on this chart of humiliation. Thanks for nothing. Next up is neo-reactionaries. Oh boy, this is a tough one. And a lot of people don't really understand what the whole neo-reactionary position even is. If you ask a neo-Marxist, they'll just say it's Fouchism. And if you ask a more socially progressive libertarian, they might also tell you that it's Fouchism, or libertarians who have turned to the dark side. But what they actually believe in is closer to a fusion of absolute monarchism and national capitalism. They have correctly identified the fact that the Enlightenment is not actually what's leading social progress in any kind of good direction, but rather it's capitalism that does that, and we actually need to switch to a system that better proliferates the free market. And neo-reactionaries kind of vary on this. Some of them are actual absolute monarchists, while some of them support a sort of weird version of mercantilism and a small state. And others are just Hoppeans who also call themselves neo-reactionaries, because technically we do share a lot in common. However, I'm just going to put it as better than status quo, even though a lot of neo-reactionaries are very based, simply because some neo-reactionaries kind of fall into the same pitfall as the alt-right. They become too pragmatic for their own good, to the point where they start to lose any kind of philosophical or ethical justification that they can take over the far left. So they're not able to properly roast a neo-Marxist in the same way that a Hoppean Hoppean such as myself would be able to do. Because we can roast the neo-Marxists on any angle, whether it's ethics, philosophy, logic, rationalism, objective truth, just straight up facts. I can go through a breadtube video, I mean, I've done it many times, and I can just go through everything they're saying and going, no, 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 you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, while still being consistent with everything that I believe. And some neo-reactionaries, specifically again the overtly pragmatic types, aren't able to always do that. Next up is the Nordic model, which is really just the mixed market system, slightly more left-leaning economically than the United States, that is followed by places like Sweden, Norway, Finland, etc. So it's kind of social liberal democracy with a strong welfare state. It is the status quo of those areas, and I'm going to put it there. However, I must point out that in many cases it could actually potentially be worse than the status quo. The problem with the Nordic model, and I know this is kind of politically incorrect to point out, but the only reason the Nordic model appears to be working in the Nordic states is because of the culture of those countries. And once that culture erodes, which it currently is doing, partially in thanks to globalism and neo-Marxism, it's going to fail pretty hard. It's a very subvertible political model. Next up is paleoconservatism, which is pretty much just, in the United States at least, the ideology of return to the 1940s, and then oppose the New Deal, which things will definitely be better if they did that. The only problem with paleocons is that they're usually the types who haven't actually studied the Austrian school of economic thought. A more well-read paleocon will either end up as a paleo-libertarian or a Rothbardian, or something along those lines. Next up is panarchism, which is the idea that you should be able to choose which state you're a part of without actually having to move. So for example, you could live in South Africa, but be governed by the laws of the United States, or Japan, or New Zealand, or whatever. It's an interesting theory. The only problem with it is that it's just better solved by anarcho-capitalism. If you're going to do that, then why not just have private corporations offering government-like services for a fee? So I think of it as more of a way to achieve anarcho-capitalism, maybe. I'll put it as slightly better than status quo. Next is participism, which is really just the ideology of Pericon, also known as participatory economics, which is one of the stupidest and most incoherent economic systems I've ever read. Most people who believe in Pericon, from what I've seen, aren't able to adequately describe it because they themselves don't understand it. And if you do actually understand it, you realize how dumb it is. Because voting on every single economic decision based on who it affects, I mean, first off, there's no objective way to even decide that, because anyone can claim subjectively that they are harmed in some mysterious way by some economic decision, and thus they should get to have a say in any kind of economic decision. It's completely incoherent and seems to stem from the sort of weird idea that the more democratic or something is, the better it is. The more voting we have, the better our system works. Never mind the fact of how just completely unfeasible and inefficient that would be, and ultimately leading to conflict due to how subjective it is. Dumb. Very, very, very dumb. I actually thought of making a video roasting just how stupid Pericon really is, and going over some of the books it's based on. The only reason I don't is because, fortunately, there aren't that many Pericon believers, and the ones that do exist, again, don't really seem to understand their own system. Or in some cases, they're just Marxists pretending to not be Marxists. And because of how incoherent it is, its praxis is not that meaningfully different from socialism. Next is Pol Potism. This is the ideology of Pol Pot. Aptly named, isn't it? It's kind of like Maoism, but somehow more psychopathic and even more dysfunctional. And it also has an interesting anti-intellectual strain to it. So it's an interesting warning of what could happen when you have a complete blithering idiot with murderous tendencies end up in charge of an entire country. And of course, it's a communist adjacent ideology. What a surprise. However, for the people who actually believe in it, anybody who supports Pol Pot, which you might find them on Reddit, is definitely an edgy teenage, far extreme lefty. They're what happens when you take an edgy teenager and instead of introducing them to Wignautism, you introduce them to Tankyism. No functioning adult actually believes in this. Are you 7 years old? Next up is the road to serfdom, also known as liberal socialism. This is really just neo-Marxists who are slightly smarter. They've figured out that their rhetoric best fits within the framework of liberalism, as this allows them to gain greater acceptance within the cathedralite status quo of globalism, and greater postmodernist theory in general. They're still basically neo-Marxists, and they're still basically useful idiots for globalists. They've just thought about it a little bit more. And so they have a political model for how society would function that is just kind of stupid and dysfunctional rather than completely stupid and dysfunctional. Next up is just Leninism, straight Leninism without the Marxism, which is pretty rare to find, honestly. Most communists will call themselves a Marxist-Leninist in some way. The main thing that makes Leninism stand out if you see somebody who just calls themselves a Leninist is it means that they are putting emphasis on the fact that they are an apologist for Vladimir Lenin's reign in the early 1900s and the early makings of the USSR. Basically, it's the heavy emphasis on the claim that Lenin did nothing wrong. And it is dumb. dumb. Oh, how very dumb it is. Lenin absolutely did things wrong. Lenin's aggression towards the other Soviet states is what led to the Great Famines and what ultimately would be the Holodomor. The only reason I'm putting this in dumb and not are you 7 years old is because in the Russian Federation today, there's a lot of historians who still praise Vladimir Lenin. He's still often celebrated as a national figure, so there's a lot of pro-Lenin propaganda out there. So depending on where you live in the world, you could potentially be an adult and still think that Vladimir Lenin did nothing wrong. However, if you run into someone outside of those countries who believes this, they are either a deeply brainwashed tanky or an edgy teenager. The idea that we should return to the system of rule of Vladimir Lenin of all people is just very, very disconnected from reality. Next up is populism, which tries to give more power to the state in hopes that the state will regulate the market in a way that takes power away from the oligarchy and gives it back to the people. Which, ironically and hilariously, is exactly what the oligarchy wants. Because the state having more power just means more power to them too. Doesn't work. I'm just gonna sit it right next to oligarchy there to highlight the hilarity of that. Peak useful idiot. The solution to the rich hiring hitmen to screw us over is to give more power and authority to the hitmen. Herder. Next is anarcho-primitivism, which is really just return to monkey. It's the idea that technology is bad and leads humans nowhere good, and therefore we need to return to the time before technology, before science, before anything really, back to the days where humans were living in caves, aka primitivism. If the idea of dying from an infected wisdom tooth in your 30s sounds excellent to you, then it's an okay political system to believe in. But in all seriousness, stop being 7 years old. Next up is anarcho-communism. This also stems from the belief that we can whip out our magical wands and change the fabric of reality so that hierarchies can somehow stop existing, and thus magically teleporting us all to a land of utopian no scarcity and magical prancing unicorns and stuff. And of course, in practice, in order to achieve that magical utopia, we have to give all our power to the state. Or alternatively, you can stop being 7 years old. Now, next is plutocracy, which is very similar to oligarchy, but not quite the same. The difference is that oligarchy is kind of something that just sort of happens with cronyism and corruption in a government, whereas plutocracy is usually the actual belief that the rich owning everything and controlling society is a good thing. And it's kind of half true. Plutocracy is only good and only makes sense if the rich gain their wealth through legitimate means and not through things like rent seeking. The idea that you should be able to control what goes on in the land that you own, so long as you're not violating other people's rights, is fine. The issue comes down to when plutocracy is also statist, in which case it's no longer meaningfully different than oligarchy. And unfortunately, that's usually what happens when people don't follow natural law, don't follow the NAP, and believe that everything should be controlled by a centralized state, while also being fine with the rich saying what goes on within a centralized state. So it's really not that much different from the status quo. And then there is reactionary liberalism, which is more of an insult that people on the far left use to accuse each other of being reactionaries. Because for some reason in the Reddit echo chamber, the word reactionary, simply calling someone a reactionary, automatically debunks or refutes whatever they're saying. But in all seriousness, anybody who actually is a reactionary liberal is really just a liberal who is in the beginning stages of questioning the status quo, hopefully, but still very much within the status quo. Although not that meaningfully different from a conservative liberal, so I'm just going to sit them right next to them. Next is reactionary libertarianism. This is when you realize that the sort of progressive ideas of neo-Marxism will ultimately just justify Marxism, but still stay within the libertarian school of thought. So not becoming a complete and total neo-prag than, say, a post-libertarian might. It's just libertarians who have in general started to take the red pill, as you can kind of call it. Most libertarians who have this mindset are honestly pretty based. It's another kind of stepping stone ideology, but it's a good stepping stone. Next is radical centrism, which honestly is really just consequentialism taken to its logical conclusion. You stop caring about ideological consistency or ideological loyalty, or really just any kind of philosophy at all, and instead just kind of aim for whatever gets the best outcome, quote unquote. If I were to imagine a radical centrist society, I can easily see one run by an AI overlord that just kind of calculates whatever would have the most favorable outcome. However, that's kind of more like a sci-fi utopian idea of radical centrism. In reality, radical centrists just tend to support the status quo because the status quo has the power to provide the evidence for what is a good outcome. Because the consequences of consequentialism are, as it turns out, human beings do not have ultimate unlimited knowledge. Nobody actually knows for sure what's going to happen in 1 month. You can use evidence and facts to guess to the best of your ability, and a lot of those will be correct. But strict consequentialism has quite a lot of flaws with it, and those flaws are always easily exploited by the ruling class. And so I kind of view radical centrists as people who are kind of a little bit more intellectual, and most of them genuinely want to make a better society. The issue is that consequentialism and then throwing all other philosophy into the trash is not the play. Most of them just end up being establishment chills. Some of them can be based, and some of them have good ideas. It really kind of differs between radical centrist to radical centrist. Because the interesting thing about centrism is that two people can be a centrist while technically believing exactly the opposite of everything from each other. For instance, you can be +5, -5, and then the other guy can be -5, +5 on any given issue. And they'll technically both be centrists, but their ideas for actually fixing the problem are radically different, which kind of shows that you can't actually really be a radical centrist. Everybody has some kind of ideology, whether they realize it or not. Anybody who thinks they have no ideology actually does have an ideology, they just haven't examined it yet. Which is why a lot of radical centrists I've met are usually people who are slightly above average IQ, but younger. They're usually either in their teens or in their 20s. They haven't quite figured out that centrism is more of a meme ideology, rather than an actual rejection of ideology. You have an ideology whether you realize it or not, and in the case of radical centrism, that's usually an ideology that's just centered around placing consequentialism above everything else. Next up is technocracy. Now, this one can kind of go either way, because technocracy has a few good things about it. For instance, it does reject democracy, or at least it recognizes that democracy is not actually the best system that humans can do. So that's pretty based. And it instead advocates for a system of governance where science decides where everything goes. So instead of having a democratically elected leader, you would have a panel of scientific experts deciding what goes where in terms of governance. And all policies will always be written by experts within the fields of which that policy is relevant to. That sounds like a good idea sometimes on paper. The problem is that technocracy can easily become a midwitocracy, because you can absolutely be an expert in a certain field, but still be a complete idiot in regards to understanding how the world operates as a whole, or even be a complete idiot in terms of understanding how your field of expertise intersects with another field. And so one very common theme you might find with someone who has an IQ of, say, 99 to 105 or something, and has a college degree and they're an expert in some field, is that you ask them a question about a different field that they're not an expert in, and they give an answer that is just so wildly wrong that a monkey making a 50-50 guess could do a better job. Because midwits try to understand other fields through the limited scope of their field, and then what happens from that is a lot of midwits end up believing that because they end up getting things wrong by thinking like that all the time, that nobody should ever think outside their field of expertise. And so they start projecting their own incompetence onto the rest of the world. And the result of that is that technocracy can end up being very, very bureaucratic, which is then easily exploited by Marxists, or just more authoritarian ideologies in general, which is why technocracy often gets allied with Marxism, even though they might not initially want it to be like that. However, I'm gonna rate it as better than status quo, simply because it is actually compatible with more libertarian schools of thought. For instance, you actually can have a libertarian monarchy with some aspects of technocracy built in, where the monarch uses a field of experts and then delegates certain tasks to them based on those fields. It's also compatible with Hoppeanism, to be honest. So its general basic idea that people who are more educated in field X should have more of a say of what goes on in field X is technically not wrong. Experts do at least usually know more about the field of which they are an expert in than the average layman would know. Next up is just socialism, straight socialism, worker ownership of the means of production. Basic problem with it is that it requires giving more power to the state if you were to have it as an actual global ideology. So just more useful idiots for the globalists. Most of them do not actually understand their own ideology either, so they're a very good example of philosophical illiteracy. A huge portion of socialists legitimately do not understand that the logical conclusion of their beliefs is state control of the means of production. They have a very, very hard time accepting that concept. When you tell that to someone who's a socialist, they'll have 1,000,001 reasons for why that's not true. They'll all be wrong, of course, and they'll all be logically flawed in some way, which makes socialists a very good example of just what philosophical illiteracy is. You can make a socialist give you an example of philosophical literacy just by asking them that one simple question and watching them flip out. Anyways, next is social libertarianism. These are the guys who support a mixed market, so government intervention into the economy for more equal outcomes and other progressive ideas, while also having the government not interfere with cultural ideas. And oh, it pains me to say this, but you guys are really just more of the status quo. When you have the government interfering with the economy to create equal outcomes, this necessarily has an impact on culture, because now it doesn't matter whether or not a culture has low or high time preference values baked into it. And so you just end up with bio-Leninism, because you're always going to have some kind of culture. And the reality is not all cultural values are equal, at least again in terms of their time preferences. And so when you get rid of that, what you're really doing is you're just mashing everybody together into one singular culture of anti-intellectualism and anti-responsibility. And again, their support for the mixed market ultimately makes them just useful idiots for the status quo. And that's sad, because I know some social libertarians have some good ideas, but really, to anybody out there who considers themselves a socially progressive libertarian while believing in the mixed market, you're not really a libertarian until you learn economics. Sorry, you need to understand why that art just doesn't work. And also you need to learn why cultures do need to be held responsible for not not caring about the future. Any society that has a culture that doesn't care about the future is not sustainable, and I would like to assume that I don't have to explain why that is. Next is state socialism, which is honestly just socialism. The only difference is that with state socialism, you're going to have socialists who at least admit that it needs a state. So they're just slightly more honest socialists. Often liberal socialists who are on their way to becoming tankies, which is not actually a good thing, but at least they're more honest. But yeah, significantly worse than the status quo. In fact, very dumb. The correct thing to do when you realize that socialism needs a highly authoritarian state in control of economic output and economic decisions and economic calculation and whatnot is to stop being a socialist. You went the wrong way on the chart. Congratulations to you for figuring out that socialism is in fact a highly authoritarian, highly statist ideology. But the correct choice was not to double down on that. So very honest, but also oh so very dumb. Next up is Strasserism. This was an ideology that was created by the Strasser brothers and was almost the ideology that the German National Socialist Party actually followed, but not quite. They hold the same views as the German National Socialists in terms of cultural views and scientific views. They're just more left-leaning economically, although not quite straight communism. It's more like, imagine if 1930s Germany followed an economic model that was closer to market socialism, but not quite to the same degree as National Bolshevism. And honestly, it probably wouldn't have been that much different. So it kind of pains me to put them down there at worse than status quo, because there are people today who still believe in Strasserism, and they do actually have a fairly good understanding of at least of what's culturally wrong with society. They've just come up with a very, very wrong answer on how to deal with that, which means that they're not really much better than the globalists that they stand against. Kinda sad, but that's kinda what happens when you don't really seriously put study into ethics and economics, and instead just look at everything through the cultural lens. So worse than status quo. And I'm going to stand them right next to the globalists that they try to stand against just to highlight the failure. While I do applaud the Strasserists for questioning the status quo, please stop being an edgy teenage Wignot. Being an edgy teenage Wignot is bad. Do not be an edgy teenage Wignot. In fact, thinking about it, I'm going to move fascism down to are you 7 years old? Because again, the people who actually unironically call themselves this and unironically associate them with 1930s Germany usually just have some growing up to do. I have never met a self-identified Nazi, not just someone who's being falsely accused of being a Nazi by someone on the far left, but someone who actually considers themselves a Nazi. I've never met one of them that was an actual functioning adult. They're always either edgy teenagers or someone who dropped out of high school or something. And again, when you start believing in an authoritarian government in order to force cultural ideas based on consequentialism, instead of just allowing freedom of association to do its job, along with the time preferences that come with it, you run into the problem where you can no longer refute the far left on any kind of philosophical or moral ground. You need to be able to look at a socialist who wants to raise taxes in order to pay for more programs and tell them, no, you can't do that because taxation is theft. And when you have an authoritarian right-wing stance that believes in heavy taxation for other reasons, it's much, much harder to refute them on things like that because you no longer have a good reason to tell them no. And so the leftists will just paint you as a psychopath who wants to use the state to interfere with everybody's lives. And so it doesn't actually work outside of being an edgy teenage meme lord, which is sadly, honestly, the only good thing about you guys. If there are any unironic Nazis listening to this, you guys do make some pretty dank memes. But that's about it. Your ideology kind of sucks. Please look up the recommended reading list of the Mises Caucus, and you'll be on your way to becoming much, much smarter. Because when you're an edgy teenage Wignot, all you're really doing is just making yourself an easy straw man for the Marxist, Leninists, and Socialists to attack. There's a very good reason why an ML in a live debate with, say, a Hoppean like myself would be just constantly throughout the entire debate trying to find some way to falsely paint me as a Nazi. That's legitimately all they would do. That would be their entire goal of the debate, because they can't actually beat a Mises Caucus libertarian on policy or economics because they don't actually understand those things. So instead, they'll just try and take advantage of the fact that most of the audience doesn't really understand those things either very well, and they'll try to falsely equate Hoppeanism or libertarian monarchism, etc. as something that it's not. Anyways, that was a rant. Next up is techno-anarchism, which is another one that can just kind of go either way, but for the most part is very based. This is an ideology about kind of subverting the state by turning the internet into an anarchist society, which to some degree they've actually succeeded in many ways, such as the invention of cryptocurrency. So to some degree, you can actually consider techno-anarchism to be the praxis of agorism, at least in the modern day. So install Gentoo and have at it. And it's a very based community. I was actually a techno-anarchist before I became a Hoppean. The only problem with them is that it's possible for them to be subverted by leftoids if you don't physically remove them from your projects. Because while people on the far left, for instance, a Marxist-Leninist, usually will agree with Mises Caucus right-wing libertarians on the concept of abolishing intellectual property rights, rights. And so they'll often become part of the sort of GNU community as well. However, the reason that they believe that, the reason that they don't believe in intellectual property rights, is a very different reason. They believe in it for the same reason they don't believe in any property rights. And so when you give them any kind of control over your projects, or say give them mod privileges in your Discord, it's only a matter of time before they start implementing very authoritarian measures within your techno-anarchy. And then it almost becomes functionally no different than if the state was censoring everything you were saying. So you have to be careful there. Every techno-anarchist listening to this should become a Hoppean as well and implement Hoppeanism into your techno-anarchism. And you will be much better off. But yeah, next is utopian socialism. Are you 7 years old? Being 7 years old is bad. Stop being 7 years old. And I mean mentally. I mean, chronologically, you'll eventually stop being 7 years old. Hopefully. Yeah, you know what I mean. Anyways, next up is universal monarchism. Now, for reasons I already discussed, monarchism in general is more based than democracy, because it solves a lot of bureaucratic problems with democracy. And the reality is democracy doesn't actually give power to the people. Democracy makes people think that they're in charge, but spoiler alert, they're not. However, in the case of universal monarchism, there's a few problems with this, because the thing is, universal monarchism is just the idea that there should be one monarch to rule over all of humanity. At least that's how I understand it. But it's the one monarch to rule them all. And that's too strict of a monopoly. The thing that makes anarcho-monarchism and libertarian monarchism significantly better and more functional versions of monarchism is because it's understood that the monarch doesn't actually own people. Rather, instead, the monarch just simply owns a small plot of land, and if people don't like how their monarch is running the place, they leave and stop financially supporting their monarch, and instead find a different monarch who runs their society a bit better. So it's a free market libertarian system of monarchs. However, with universal monarchy, it's more of a monopoly, and not so much free market. And another problem is that universal monarchy would probably just end up in practice being a form of socialism or Marxist-Leninism. And so in terms of ideology, it's better than the status quo, but in terms of what it would actually end up as in terms of outcome, it would probably be worse than the status quo. So I'm just gonna throw it into status quo, which is a hard decision, but that's just kinda how the ups and downs work. Anyways, next is voluntary human extinction. You know, you might think that this is a meme ideology that I'm just throwing in here for fun, and to some degree I am. It is just kind of a stupid meme ideology. But it is an ideology that a lot of people, sadly, unironically believe. This is the ideology followed by anti-natalists. They believe in voluntary human extinction via not having children anymore, because living bad and humans bad for various reasons. Now, of course, the problem with anti-natalist ideology, which I kind of went over before, is that anti-natalists have an ideology that is both based on subjectivism and based on things that can't actually be verified. So they use their morality based on the sort of care-harm morality matrix, and then they extend that morality to people who aren't born yet, and then saying, oh, you could harm them by bringing them into existence, and that's bad. And the problem is that care-harm morality is a dumb morality system, and anti-natalists have simply pushed that to its logical clowny conclusions without realizing that what they've actually found is one of the reasons why care-harm morality as a meta-ethical model is kinda stupid. The reality is, the correct answer is that people who do not exist yet don't have property rights. You can't extend property rights to the non-existent. You can't enslave yourself to people who aren't real, just because that could potentially hurt their feelings. That's very stupid and very dumb, and that's exactly where voluntary human extinction goes. Next is Itadism, which was kind of a nationalist ideology of the Ottoman Empire. They were the ones guilty of the Armenian genocide, who many of them still deny to this day. The only kind of benefit to them is that they were against socialism, but other than that, they were kind of deranged radicals. So to bring them back today would be worse than the status quo. Next up is just straight liberalism, which is liberalism as a sort of ideology and philosophy as it was first being created, such as from minds like Aristotle. And liberalism has some good ideas. For instance, it's open towards the idea of a free market, or at least allows for it to somewhat exist. However, straight liberalism tends to fall for the problem of egalitarianism, which eventually forces you to believe in some really stupid things like cultural relativism, and eventually leading toward equity crap. So liberalism is kind of an attempt to do the right thing, and from it you can do the right thing. For instance, you can go the libertarian route from liberalism, but as a base ideology, it's too easily subverted, and thus it is just kind of the status quo. To have a chance of being better than the status quo, you can't just call yourself a liberal. That's usually what people who haven't really studied politics will do. They'll just identify as a liberal and not really understand anything else. But to actually be better where clown world of the status quo is leading us, you have to take a more specific stance, like for instance, specifically at the very least, being a conservative liberal or a classical liberal. Calling yourself a straight liberal is usually a sign of being politically illiterate in some way, or just a boomer who hasn't kept up with the times. Anyways, next is libertarianism. These specifically are the minarchists who believe in sort of a liberal minarchy or a democratic minarchy. It would be better than the status quo. The only problem is that the inherent flaws of liberalism allow it to be subverted to no longer be libertarian. So it's kind of at the bottom of better than status quo. The only thing worthy of note here is pointing out that pragmatically, pretty much all libertarians who are living within a liberal democracy to some degree, even though it's kind of a fake democracy, we are all kind of pragmatically forced to, in some ways, be a libertarian, because that is kind of the status quo you live in. So it's important to understand that this sort of democratic minarchism, while not the goal, is something that when you go to the voting box, you normally have to vote for anyway. It is generally the smart path for any libertarian to vote against the state having more control or more power over any given thing. So it is not the ideal praxis, but it is a praxis you sometimes have to go by. So I put it at bottom of better than status quo. Anyways, next is Christian theocracy. Oh boy, time to lose a few subscribers. Sorry, but I have to say it because it's objectively true. Christian theocracy would not be any better than status quo. The problem with it is you just replace the academic midwits with clergy midwits. And while they do have some culturally based ideas, don't get me wrong, I'm not bashing the Bible here or anything. The Bible has a lot of ideas in it that are very good time preferenced, which is partially why Christianity has survived for so long. But the problem is when you have a theocracy, Christian theocracy in general tends to be very anti-science and anti-technology, and ultimately ends up being a kind of market socialist way of doing things. Perhaps if it follows distributism, it might be a little less insane, but not really. I will give it this and say that a Christian theocracy is a little bit more stable than the current neoliberal status quo. It can last a lot longer, but it can also be subverted by some really stupid things. For instance, it tends to believe in egalitarianism, and that can easily be subverted into socialism. And then you would end up with the Christian version of Christian National Bolshevism or something like that, which would be very much not based, unless you like breadlines. I think anybody who believes that Christian theocracy would be the best model for society should instead recognize that private societies would be able to give you what you want in a voluntary system without forcing the world to go along with it. And last is gonna be post-sadism, which is kind of a really funky meme ideology, but surprisingly there is a small cult of people who actually believe it. Anyway, it comes from the belief that you would need a socialist society in order to advance technology to the level of being able to visit other planets, and because post-sadists believe in UFOs, they believe that the existence of UFOs confirms that alien civilizations exist, that they are advanced, and that they all therefore must be socialist. And so all we need to do in order to join the Galactic Socialist Federation is to engage in nuclear war that would wipe out all of society. And then aliens would come and help us rebuild into the socialist utopia. Yeah, that is what they actually unironically believe. In fact, if anything, I'm downplaying it. It's a little bit crazier than that. But just for the heck of it, I'm going to kind of judge this. I mean, it's a little bit insane for what it is, but I'm going to kind of judge this in a more general sense. Because a lot of people who have beliefs that are radically different from the current status quo also have this belief where they can't wait for society to collapse, so that way their political system can be implemented. And I want to point that out because, in my opinion, that is a deeply delusional belief to have, regardless of what your ideology is. You have no control over what a power vacuum will result in. But the vast majority of time, if we were to just go by history, it usually results in a strongman dictator taking control of everything. It usually results in some kind of military guerrilla ingsoc that is self-justified by some kind of fringe cult ideology. That is what actually happens when society collapses. Destroying society in order to create a better society doesn't really work. And I kind of need to put emphasis on this because I've seen a few libertarians who believe this too, like collapsitarian anarcho-capitalists who are fully aware of things like market socialism within democracy is incompatible with open borders because that would collapse the economy, and they go along with it anyway because that's a good thing. No. If modern civilization ends by collapse, which sadly it might do, it's not gonna be fun. Just warning you right now. It's probably gonna be some psycho that gains control for a while. That's just how it is. That's how the collapsoid mindset has always worked. Stop being 7 years old. Anyways, that is all. Wow, that was a much longer video than I thought it would be. Hope you all enjoyed my ridiculous takes. That will be all for this video. Please like, comment, and subscribe for the algorithm, and if you like my content and want to support me, you can support me on either Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch. But again, there is a new shirt out. I'm going to be making some new shirts that are the opposite of the previous shirts I was doing, which were just text. I'm going to be putting some shirts out on the merch store that are just graphic. And the profits, of course, really help my channel and the continuation of my content. But for now, that is all. Till next time.